Good morning. We're here today to go through the final public release of the Broadband Garrett County study that we've been working on for the past 7 months or so.
Frank, you
Okay. I'm Frank Schapp, the Department of Economic Development here in Garrett County, and have been tasked with the development of this plan and, more importantly, the implementation of the plan going forward. We're pleased today to say that we've completed the plan within budget and within the time frame that we established through the work with our technology consultant, Columbia Telecommunications Corporation. They're based in Kensington, Maryland. Ms. Joanne Hovis is here. She is the CEO of CTC and will be conducting the presentation today to describe what our findings and recommendations are in the plan and how we intend to move forward. We'll spend about 30 minutes or so in the presentation, a little bit of time for Q&A afterwards, and then we will post an electronic version of the complete plan on the county website and on the county Facebook page today. So every citizen and everyone of you will have access to that plan. We made printed copies for the commissioner today, but we figured to make sure of staying green, we limit the amount of paper that we actually produce, so everything will be available online. I want to recognize a couple of folks in the room. First off, my compatriot, Nathaniel Watkins, our County Director of IT, who has been instrumental and essential and irreplaceable in helping us get this far, and more importantly, going forward, we'll fill all those roles as well. It's a real collaboration. We have two representatives from Skyline Engineering. They are the contractor that the state has hired to engineer and construct the fiber infrastructure that's being deployed as part of the federal grant to Maryland, the One Maryland Broadband Network, and that's Dan Leskinen is a senior engineer, John White, Garrett County resident, who has recently joined Skyline and is the project manager for the work here in the county. And welcome to John. With that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Ms. Hovis, and she'll spend the next few minutes going through the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning. Keep an eye on the time for me, Frank, as you always do, just so I know I'm being respectful of time. It's a pleasure to be here again, and what I'm going to do today is just briefly review what we've done over the past 7 or 8 months, and you've seen me a number of times and have had updates over that time period, and then I'll, at a very relatively high level, summarize what we learned about broadband and broadband use in Garrett County, and then describe some of our recommendations and the upsides and downsides of all of them, and then hopefully take whatever questions there are. So we started last summer to look at both the supply and demand sides of broadband communications infrastructure in Garrett County. On the supply side, we reviewed maps, reviewed physical infrastructure, did testing out in the field, and asked lots and lots of questions of the community and also of the providers about what is out here, where are the gaps, what kinds of technologies are there, and what are those technologies capable of. And I'll talk in a minute about what we discovered. On the demand side, we did extensive survey work in the residential, business, and agricultural communities to get a sense of what the needs are, how those needs are being met or not being met, where the gaps are, where the price challenges are, and what the opportunities are, how Garrett County community members would use broadband more or differently if they had more opportunities, or potentially if pricing were different. And we did that analysis as well. And we spoke extensively with just about every private sector provider who is in this county or has considered coming to this county or is relatively close and might be induced to come to the county. And then we spoke with a range of other potential partners who are not really telecommunications companies, such as the power company, who we think down the road might be a real partner for infrastructure development. And we looked at a range of issues around both education as to how to use broadband and maximize the value of broadband, and then also deployment, the actual physical infrastructure and how we can expand that in the county. That's the big picture of the past 7 or 8 months. And I see a lot of friendly faces. I think I've spoken with most of you at various times over the last few months. So what have we found? We find that the county, relative to most rural communities, is reasonably well served. And I don't want to overstate that because compared to other rural communities is unfortunately not a very high bar to meet or exceed. As we've discussed in the past, the greatest challenge in the United States, as in the rest of the world, around rural broadband is the incredibly high capital costs of building to remote areas and the relatively low potential return given the remoteness of those areas and lack of density of population and therefore customers. And that's the biggest challenge around rural broadband. And that's why in significant numbers of rural counties in the United States, there is almost no broadband in many cases. There are relatively prosperous rural counties where there's almost no cellular service, which we wouldn't even call broadband. It's a narrowband, a voice technology that's not capable of data. So Garrett County turns out to have more infrastructure than many rural parts of the United States. That said, its infrastructure is not on a par with metropolitan areas of the United States for all those economic reasons I referenced a moment ago, and not on par with the metropolitan areas of Maryland in particular, which, because of their proximity presumably to Washington, D.C., on Route 95 on the East Coast, are relatively well served. Again, relative to much of the United States. Not necessarily relative to Asia and Europe, but relative to much of the United States. But that said, what you have already been doing is working. The way in which this community has reached out to the private sector, has sought to look for all the ways possible to facilitate access on the part of the private sector. As I saw through my personal experience, when a phone company or a wireless company asks for permission to build a tower, the way is smooth for them, the process is simple, the reception is very welcoming. This is a community that is actively welcoming in private investment, and that is working. You are at a level of service that is higher than we had anticipated. Let me actually show you on the map what this looks like. Give me a moment here. This, I don't know how evident it is, and commissioners, you have a copy of this map in the back of your book. It might be easier to see. But what we found in terms of the existing infrastructure, putting aside where the proposed and existing fiber is we found that you have along 219, around the lake, in all the population centers, including Grantsville and Friendsville to some degree, relatively decent broadband coverage. You have some DSL from the phone company, you have two high-quality, serious, committed cable companies in Chantel and Comcast, both of which have recently or are currently investing in those networks to bring them up to the state-of-the-art. The Comcast cable system is state-of-the-art. It is comparable to what you would get in Bethesda or in Annapolis or in Baltimore. And then the Chantel system down here in Oakland and just north is a little bit antiquated, but Chantel is actively investing right now to bring it to the state-of-the-art and seems absolutely committed to that. So you have two really good corporate partners in those companies for residential service. And then the big thing that has, in our opinion, increased the availability of broadband in the county over the past year and a half or so is mobile wireless broadband. And that's primarily from AT&T and US Cellular, who are your two legacy companies here. And with the exception of the areas that are state land, state parks, tough to reach, and have very little population, there is reasonably good wireless broadband in many areas of the county. It's not ubiquitous because there are all kinds of technical challenges in some areas, but it's reasonably solid. It's not the same as cable modem service, it's a fraction of the speed, but for mobility it's incredibly important, and as I said before, it doesn't exist in many rural counties. AT&T has made a real investment over the past couple of years. We've seen a huge increase in the quality of their service. It is not quite the state-of-the-art, but we are hoping that they will get there over the next few years. And US Cellular tells us that they are currently deploying what we call 4G services. A lot of controversy over that term, but essentially state-of-the-art services are coming from US Cellular, and we believe that we have reason to believe that they're investing in new towers and fiber as we speak in Garrett County. So you'll see improved service. Again, though, mobile broadband is not necessarily a substitute for wireline broadband. And I'll go into more detail about this in a few minutes, but one of the primary reasons for that is that the bandwidth is not as high, but also mobile broadband, in the last couple of years, we've seen an imposition of data caps. That means that if in my remote home in Garrett County, my only source of broadband is mobile, and I have a data cap, I could, after 2 hours of video stream of educational content for my children, or a two-way video stream in which I'm working, if I'm running a home business, I could run through my data allotment for the month and be into much, much higher pricing. So in order to get the kinds of capacity over time that we might want for economic development in a home where there's only mobile service, it could become extremely pricey because of the imposition of data caps in recent years. And that's the challenge. The other thing that I should say is that for all that, as I said, your wireline infrastructure is pretty good in the residential market and in the business market as well, one challenge is that this is not specific to Garrett County. The DSL infrastructure, which is the broadband infrastructure that Verizon and the other phone companies have implemented over their old copper wires, they are just not an area of particular interest or investment for the phone companies anymore. Their emphasis, all of their investment, and frankly, a huge amount of their profit is on the wireless side. That's where they see the future. So the old DSL infrastructure that many of our small businesses and homes have relied on for 10 or 15 years in some cases is not being expanded, and in some cases, in many parts of the country, is not even being particularly well maintained. And what we see in Garrett County, and I've seen this throughout Maryland and frankly throughout the country, is that if you call for service, while there appears to be service available, let's say in Oakland, if you call, they'll say, the system's tapped out, we're not adding new customers. So what would appear to be something of a competitive market between phone and cable isn't quite. Cable has a technological advantage, and it seems much more committed to its wireline infrastructure. We're not seeing new wireline infrastructure coming in. The other thing you have in Garrett County, when we're talking about the availability of broadband that is, I think, quite remarkable, is you have a very vibrant local entrepreneurial economy. You have a number of entrepreneurs who are located here and who have built quite capable networks here. And this is very unusual. We are, for the most part, truly in an industry that is dominated by a few giants in the phone, cable, and wireless worlds. And the existence of local entrepreneurs is unusual. So the three that come to mind immediately are IceWeb, which has some wireless holdings down here. You have Procom that has fiber to the home on West Mountain and down along the lake and 219 into parts of Oakland, and QCall up in the northern part of the county. Quite remarkable networks in all cases, but facing all of those same economic challenges that I mentioned before, of very high capital costs, high operating costs, relatively small customer base, so relatively low revenues, and they have the enormous challenge of not having the kind of scale that you have if you're Comcast or AT&T or Verizon. So not as easy to make it work. That's the existing landscape of broadband in the county. That's what we found on the availability side. I'm going to go right back to the presentation. On the demand side, and this is a really interesting outcome as well, we were really pleasantly surprised also by your adoption rate. The adoption and use of broadband in the county is very high. As I told you last time we met, we were astonished by the response level to all three surveys. In all three cases, they were higher than I've ever seen in my career, both before and after we did your surveys here. And in all three cases, we saw a really significant level of interest, somewhat lower in the agricultural community, which suggests that there is still quite a bit of room in the agricultural community to learn about the benefits of broadband and what economic benefit it can bring to somebody in that particular economic sector. The numbers, we had a number of different sources of data, and it's all described in some detail, the methodology in the report. I won't go into detail now, but our conclusion is that about 78% of the homes, businesses, and farms in Garrett County are using broadband. I'm sorry, are using internet of some sort. Of them, 64% are using broadband, which would be defined as DSL cable, fiber, or mobile wireless of broadband speeds. So there is a pretty real gap between 64 and 78 of people who are still using dial-up internet, the kinds of technology that many of us haven't used in more than 15 years, and that without question slows their ability for their children to learn, for them to run home-based businesses and so on, for them to truly get the benefits of the internet. Those numbers suggest a very high level of interest. These are numbers that are comparable to any urban or suburban part of the United States at any socioeconomic level in terms of adoption and use. And while there are some gaps there, you'll see we have some recommendations around how to increase that number even further. So that's a very quick summary of what we learned, and we've got many pages of it there if you want more detail or questions from me. Our recommendations, I think, can be really divided up into three broad categories. Number one is, what can the county build itself? What must it build itself? Because there's really no private partner to build it without county assistance. The second is, what can the county do for those private partners that may lead them to take some action? And the third is, what can the county do on the demand side rather than the supply side, which is what number 1 and 2 are, to try to increase the use by county residents of this incredibly important infrastructure tool. So, I'm actually going to start with the second and third category and then come back to the first, which is the really big one, the hard one, and the pricing one. And how am I doing for time, Frank?
You have about 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk faster.
25.
Okay, thank you. We wrote up in some detail a range of different recommendations about things that the county, particularly the Economic Development Department, can do to try to facilitate and spur private investment in the county. And we and Frank and Nathaniel met extensively, and Commissioner Rayleigh met extensively with many of the carriers and other private sector partners to look for opportunities along these lines. I won't go into enormous detail about what all their strategic plans are, but as I said a few minutes ago, we've seen this almost complete stopping of investment in wireline infrastructure. And that, for Comcast, is really the reality, certainly for Verizon, in terms of what they're going to build in the county. Chantel is upgrading their existing system, but like Comcast, they don't have any plans or any strong business case to expand the range of their footprint. So where they already are, they will improve the service and bring it up to par, but expanding further out into the county to places they have not served in the past is not on their agenda. And that's true of Comcast as well. Comcast, though, is very aggressively looking for institutional and business customers in the enterprise market, where the returns are significantly higher for them because pricing is much higher. So in the business community, there may be some more opportunities, but mostly on the higher end of the business community, the institutional and government users. What we did with both Comcast and Chantel, and many of our recommendations relate to this, is looking for opportunities, looking for places. We went through and did some engineering and identified locations where we thought they could relatively cost-effectively get to certain neighborhoods or developments where there was some density of population and where there might be a return for those companies. They have no plans, they have no particular interest in the moment at expanding their footprint, but what we're trying to do is to show them, here's a place where your costs are going to be somewhat concentrated, and here's 20 homes. And they are both actively, at the moment, both of those companies are actively reviewing the maps we gave them and the locations. And Chantel in particular seems very interested in looking for opportunities. Our recommendations include such things as, we know that specifically in the case of Chantel, they tell us that they would be more amenable to building and to spending, even at lower densities, if they know that a certain percentage of the homes that they would pass would make a commitment up front to buy service for some period of time. This is something that the county can do to educate many of the members of the community who are calling and saying, I can't get cable service, why can't I get cable? The answer can be, if you and your neighbors are able to work together and show the company that you will commit to services up front, they're going to be far more likely to make the investment to build into your community, that sort of thing. We have a range of other recommendations that also relate to this around coordinating any time there is a street cut or a ditch open, or some kind of other construction in the rights-of-way, some kind of capital improvement project, or even private sector construction, that all of the relevant players be notified so that the opportunity to come in and potentially put in conduit or fiber at that time, much more cost-effective than coming back after the fact and having to open the road again, that they would know about it at a minimum. These are incremental strategies. These are not strategies that change the world. They might make a difference in a significant handful of cases over time, but they're relatively low cost, and they're just among the things that it's relatively easy for government to do, and that is entirely within the traditional purview of government, and that just make the county as business friendly as possible and as consumer friendly as possible at the same time. So those are the recommendations around facilitating carrier expansion. Related to that, we recommend facilitating cost-effective commodity bandwidth for competitive providers. And let me take a second, just so that we're all on the same page. When we talk about commodity bandwidth, it's a term of art that refers to the actual bandwidth that enables you to get onto the internet itself and traverse the internet. When I buy cable modem service at my home, I am buying a certain number of megabits of access to the internet, as well as transport to the internet. So if you deploy a network within Garrett County, you could have an intranet in which you are communicating internally on your own network. But in order to get to the public internet and reach things in places that are not on your own network, you need commodity internet bandwidth. And commodity internet bandwidth has been traditionally an incredibly costly commodity. It has come down in price in metropolitan areas exponentially. In places where 5 years ago we were paying $100 a megabit, in some urban areas we're now paying $2 or $3 a megabit. The change is just extraordinary. That incredible reduction in price has not yet extended to rural areas. This is one of the areas where we think the county can have a very big impact. Thanks to the One Maryland broadband network, there will be new public interest fiber that comes into the county, and the Maryland Broadband Co-op will be selling commodity internet, bringing it up here and selling it here in this market. We believe that the county can help some of the smaller providers, like IceWeb, that may not have the kind of scale to be able to negotiate big deals, or may not have the kind of leverage they need for that sort of thing, but the county can facilitate, can help to consolidate some of the needs of local entrepreneurs, can buy commodity bandwidth in bulk from the co-op or from other providers that may be interested in providing service over that fiber, and try to bring some of the savings from the Baltimore area, let's say, or from Ashburn, Virginia, which is one of the internet's big international meeting places, up to the county and to make it more cost effective. And to give you an example of what this could mean, you'll see in the report we talk about the fact that IceWeb is currently paying around $1,000 a month for 3 megabits of commodity internet bandwidth. So let's say, to be generous, $300 and something per megabit per month. As I mentioned, in Baltimore you can probably buy the same thing at $2. It costs some money to bring it up here, but not the difference between $2 and $330. So the savings that could potentially be realized by a company like ISWEB or by other local entrepreneurs as a result of the new fiber coming into the county and some county facilitation and support and help could enable a company like ISWEB to reduce its prices, to increase the bandwidth that it's offering its customers, to invest in more equipment and expand its footprint and offer service to more customers, that sort of thing. It could be incredibly important and transformative, and again, it's a relatively low effort strategy on the part of the county. So those are the kinds of recommendations we made around facilitating and assisting private sector players.
15.
Thank you. I'm just getting some good stuff. Really quickly, I'm going to jump here. I'm really going out of order here. Let me talk about educational opportunities. We think that there's some real room for supporting members of the community who have not yet realized or been able to afford the value of broadband. And we make some recommendations around that. It's things like taking advantage of and publicizing Comcast Internet Essentials program, which is a program where Comcast offers low-cost bandwidth and relatively cheap computers to people whose children qualify for the free and reduced school lunch program. There's a significant effort at getting to through the education piece of that, but once that's done, it's really a very impressive program. It's got a relatively short life, and now is the opportunity to take advantage of it. The other cable companies are making commitments that are very similar to that. Chantel has not yet done so, but we have encouraged them to do so, and the county can continue with that kind of encouragement.
Jane, excuse me, do you have an idea of how to reach out there? I mean, I know that this was one of the ones the Board of Education didn't want to get involved in because of, you know, being kind of proprietary to Comcast. I mean, and they have the information.
So the Board of Education didn't want to distribute Comcast materials in schools because they would then be appearing to endorse a particular product or vendor.
Right.
So the strategies that Comcast has taken in some other communities is advertisements on the radio and in newspapers, working with Boys and Girls Clubs, working with community nonprofits that serve low-income residents, and so on. My guess is that their efforts have been uneven from community to community, depending on who is staffing it. And I think one thing that the county can do is just put quite a bit of pressure on Comcast to say, what are you doing here to let our residents know about it? Because the obligation shouldn't have to be the board's. I understand where they came from, but this really is Comcast's obligation. It undertook it voluntarily as a means of trying to make the Comcast NBC Universal merger look good to the FCC. And it was a major factor in the consideration of many groups that supported the merger. And so Comcast should come through now, and I think it's very reasonable for the county to keep some pressure on to make sure that they are publicizing the program adequately in Garrett County.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are a number of other educational efforts that we recommended, for example, for small businesses that may not yet have gotten the benefits of understanding what cloud services could do for them in terms of the workings of their businesses and the other benefits that broadband can deliver to a small business just located in McHenry or in Oakland and that have broadband or have access to it and don't realize the kinds of savings it can really give their businesses. And so among other recommendations, we suggest that the county could, at extremely low cost, set up periodic, maybe monthly, educational events for small businesses in which contractors or vendors or IT professionals could describe some of the values and talk about some of these applications. And again, relatively low cost, relatively low effort, but potentially a pretty big impact in terms of those kinds of efforts. And there's some other things around the demand creation, but that's sort of the big picture. I'm going to come to governance last, but let me talk. With respect to ARC and other funding opportunities, we did a full survey of all of the funding opportunities available at the state and federal level. as well as some of the foundation opportunities. And the report summarizes where all of these different programs are and what their potential is in terms of Garrett County. This is not a particularly great moment to be looking for federal government funding for just about anything. We happen to be in a particularly tough moment, I would say, both politically and from a budgetary standpoint. That said, we make some recommendations around the things that we think have more potential than others, and that's all in the report. We assisted the county through the Economic Development Department to apply for an ARC grant to expand and make best use of the fiber that you're going to be getting, and to add to it for some really key and very important public facilities and nonprofit facilities. And looked at the feasibility of that, as well as a couple of other FCC and Department of Agriculture opportunities that we think may emerge over the next couple of years. Assuming that the ARC grant is funded, you will see quite a bit more fiber and use of fiber coming into the county. I'm going to go back to the map now to talk about the recommendations around infrastructure and what the county might build. So if you look at this map, the blue fiber along the top is owned by Level 3, which is one of the big private fiber owners in the United States. And the state has access to some of that fiber, and that's how it is planning to come across from Allegheny County and into Garrett County. Then the red is the fiber that the state has just finished engineering and will be building starting actually in the next few weeks. And that's the One Maryland fiber, to which the county will have some access as a partner to the state. We'll pay for some of that access, but we'll be able to meet the needs of public facilities at a level that has never been the case in the past. The proposed new fiber is up at the top. You'll see a little bit of green to bridge some of the gaps. And there are a couple of other spots, such as right here. And the ARC grant and the county portion of that, the county commitment as part of the ARC grant, are what will go to add that additional fiber and also to provide equipment to enable all of this fiber to be usable. Big picture summary of your fiber situation. That investment in fiber, in our opinion, is a really good one. It not only enables service to key county facilities on the public and the nonprofit side, such as Garrett County Community Action, but it also opens up all of this bandwidth and dark fiber that will be available through the co-op to the private sector. And the idea behind that, the idea of the state, of the county, and of the federal government that funded all of the fiber in red, is that when you have this here, hopefully you will have some kind of small local entrepreneur or a bigger company or a community group that will make use of it and maybe deploy something wireless here to try to reach this community, as an example, or out here, etc. That's the idea. You're opening up these big new roads where none existed before, and you're making them available to everyone. Here's what we have proposed in addition to that fiber investment, and it's on the second map. We looked at a range of different technologies in light of where we think you are in terms of broadband availability. And where we think you are, by the way, is considerably north of 75% availability of residential households. And we think it's going to get even higher over the next couple of years as U.S. Cellular improves its network, which is underway currently. But there are still some pretty significant gaps where there is no wireline infrastructure right now and where we don't see any coming. And we looked at technologies like fiber to the home, which is the holy grail of communications infrastructure, which in an ideal world would go to every home and business in rural America, as it is many of our competitor nations, but which would also entail an investment of $200 million. And we didn't look at it too seriously beyond big picture pricing, just given realities. But given the needs in these particular locations, which we identified in collaboration with Frank and Nathaniel, and the limitations that I described earlier on mobile broadband that result from some of the technological challenges, but also that result from the fact that that is an industry with data caps. What we did is we designed a proposed network for you, a wireless network, that would be targeted at these areas. And each of those dots in those different colors is a household. And the idea here is this, well, let me start with the bottom line. Bottom line is $1.2 million in terms of the cost of building this kind of network. And it would have the capability of reaching 2,900 households. And that availability to that 2,900 households would bring you above the 90% threshold of broadband availability to residential addresses in Garrett County, which was the goal of the Economic Development Strategic Plan. And this would be a product, although it is wireless, that would not be capped in terms of bandwidth. And that would not really be a mobile product. It would be a point-to-point product. And by that, I mean just something that you would use in your home the same way you would use a DSL or a Comcast connection, as opposed to something that you think of as, I can take this on the road with me. And I can go to Allegheny County, or I can go down to Washington, or I can go to Pittsburgh, and it's still going to work. This is not that kind of wireless product. This is a wireless product for the whole business. It's point-to-point. But without many of the limitations that come with the commercial products that have bandwidth caps. And the bandwidth would not be astronomical. Most likely, given current pricing and the way we worked, the business model, it would be about 3 to 4 megabits per second downstream and 1 upstream. But that is better than you can get with many mobile products right now. And as I said, it wouldn't be capped. So you would have that kind of speed on an ongoing basis every day and all night if you needed it. So you could conceivably run a small business out of your home in these areas. And that's what that network would look like. Let me show you what it looked like on the financial side. Wrong document, sorry. All right, let's start with this. I'll give you the technology first.
Joanne, don't feel rushed. This is very important, and our times are flexible. This is very important.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I want to be respectful, though, because once I start talking, it can go for a long time. So I try to be very
I know the
cautious. Thank you. And you're a wonderful audience, so thank you. For a range of different reasons, our engineers chose wireless, in part because it's cost effective, and they chose something called TV white spaces as the technology. The first consideration around the wireless technology was to use unlicensed spectrum, so that you don't have the costs of buying spectrum or leasing spectrum, which is extremely complex and extremely costly. And there are a few different bands of unlicensed spectrum. The one that would traditionally be used was not a possibility here in Garrett County, because just over the border in West Virginia, there is a satellite farm owned by a big phone company that limits your use of those particular spectrum bands within this kind of proximity. So what we turn to next was TV white spaces. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it, but this is a very new area and a very exciting one. What the TV white spaces are essentially the unused spectrum between the television broadcasters, the over-the-air broadcasters. And with advances in technology in recent years, that unused spectrum is really usable for data purposes as an unlicensed medium. The FCC has approved that use and has been constantly liberalizing the rules under which it can be used. We believe, and I think most people believe, at the very beginning of a really very exciting renaissance in use of this technology, perhaps akin to the early days of Wi-Fi, if you think about it, how fast that technology developed. And the important part about that is if you think about Wi-Fi in its early days, the more it grew and developed and more people adopted it, the more companies built equipment for it and the lower the pricing on equipment became. Until at this point, Wi-Fi is a pretty inexpensive thing to do in a localized area in your home, your business, and so on. Now, for the reasons having to do with the spectrum that Wi-Fi is in, it's not a particularly great technology for doing a big scale deployment like this one. But what's so great about the TV white spaces is that the spectrum it is in is the best spectrum for purposes of what we're talking about. The propagation characteristics are really outstanding. And that's why it's incredibly valuable. You sometimes hear people talk about beachfront spectrum, or what they're talking about is this is where you want to be for data. And we've got relatively small slices between the television channels, but they're valuable and they're exciting. That said, we're very much at the beginning of this. We're just starting to see these deployments, which has its benefits and its risks. The benefits are that if you do this, you'll get unbelievable amounts of PR. Lots of people coming into the county to tour and to hear about it and to write articles about it and eating in the restaurants here. But it is really at the beginning. That said, this is not an illusory technology. We're not talking about something that has been imagined but not created. The equipment exists to do all of this. That's sort of the big picture of what the network looks like. One last thing before I get to the financials. We, based on the data we saw from the market research, we estimated that at a $40 per month price point, we would probably see a 30% take rate minimum among those 2,900 homes. So you increase the price, take rate's going to go down, no question about it, and vice versa. But $40 a month, based on our experience and based on the data that came out of the market research, is a very, very reasonable price. The standard price on a mobile broadband product from Verizon or AT&T or US Cellular is going to be more like $60 and sometimes more. And as I said, there's a bandwidth cap there, so you go above your 5 gigabytes per month or whatever the number is, and you're going into significantly higher pricing. Here we'd be at 40. It's competitive even with cable modem in terms of the pricing. 30%, we're conservative about our recommendations, so we say 30% take rate. It's a conservative estimate, but when we do a business plan, we'd like to be pretty conservative about it because it would be the county left holding the bag. So this is sort of how the financials play out. In the report, you'll see we have extensive pro formas with all of the assumptions laid out. And we did the pro formas, including the cash flow statements, the income statements, the balance sheets, and everything else that would appropriately go with it to allow you to make an educated decision about this. We did it in two ways. One is assuming that you were financing the $1.2 million at a 6% interest rate, and the other is that there's no need to finance, that there would be a $1.2 million investment made out of reserves up front, and so there wouldn't be principal and interest payments on a monthly basis. This is sort of how it plays out. If we assume, here's our base case, a 30% take rate at $40 a month service charge, and you're financing it, there's no upfront payment, but the annual subsidy is about $250,000. That's what it would cost the county to make service available to its 2,900 homes, assuming 30% of them actually buy it. And so your negative cash balance at the end of the 5 years is about $1.25 million. These are not additive. That's 250,000 times 5 equals that. That's what it would cost you over the course of the 5 years, which is roughly the cost of building the network to begin with. So another way of thinking about it is, on an operational basis, it pays for itself, but the capital cost is something that would have to be absorbed by the county. And you can see here where we make the assumption that there's a cash available up front and there are no principal and interest payments and you don't have financing costs. On the base case 30% adoption, it's pretty much the same picture. You put up $1.2 million up front, the network cash flows on an ongoing basis, not exactly from year to year. Year 2 and 3 are a little bit below and then above. So there'd be a need to bridge, but at the end of 5 years, you have a positive cash balance of $167,000. So essentially it pays for itself on an operating basis, but the county pays to build the network. That's a big picture, assuming a 30% take rate. At 20%, it's quite substantially more in terms of cost. And at 65% take rate, it pays for itself in terms of the capital cost as well as its operating costs. 65% take rate is not inconceivable, but it's extremely high and not necessarily something I would count on. I want to give you a chance to ask questions about this, and I can go into a lot more detail around other financials, but the bottom line around this kind of network is that the economics are the same for the county as they would be for anyone else, except that you don't require a profit, which makes it a little bit easier. But the capital costs of building broadband are really high, and it's just highly unlikely. I would be an irresponsible consultant if I said you can count on it paying for itself over time. And at the end of 5 years, 5 to 7 years, depending on the life of the equipment, you're pretty much back where you started, and there's a need for another infusion of $1.2 million or to finance again, because wireless equipment has a relatively short life, and over those 5 to 7 years, the equipment will improve, there'll be better opportunities, but the pricing will also presumably come down. I will say one last thing, and I'm sorry, because I know Nicole has a question, but the bulk of the cost on the capital side is actually not as much equipment as it is labor. The cost of the network and the operating cost is where a huge amount of your investment will go is into labor, because this is a labor-intensive thing. Somebody's going to have to go out and set up every new customer as well as building the network to begin with. So at least a substantial piece of that is going to go into creating new jobs in Garrett County. That said, there's a big capital cost as well, and a commodity bandwidth cost. But both of those things will hopefully incrementally come down over time. So the financial picture might be slightly better 2 years from now if we were to revisit this in 2 years. But because so much of it is labor, I wouldn't say it would be substantially different.
Let me just ask a question first. Is there anyone here for the public hearing on the Frank Custer Road? Anyone here to specifically discuss that? Because that public hearing is scheduled for 11 o'clock.
Is that right? I don't know who's scheduled to come. I hadn't heard about it.
Okay. I mean, it's just a public hearing, so it could be that no one's coming is the other thing. And that's why I wanted to ask that question, because I feel comfortable now that we continue on, and then we'll take up the public hearing at the end of that time, since there's no one else here to speak to that issue. All right. Nicole, you had a question?
Well, just so I'm clear, so earlier when you went through the recommendations, you said one of the recommendations was the county's investment in the last mile, or it's either private or the county possibility, the county investment last mile. Is this in addition to that, or is this the model that would be used instead of actually building hardwire last mile?
Yeah, this is our recommended investment for the county in the last mile. If the county chooses to invest in the last mile, we believe this is the most cost-effective way to get to as many homes as possible. And this is not to say that there's not a private sector potential for this. Here's the challenge around the private sector potential, and we sort of played it out with many of the private sector partners. This is not what the big incumbents do. This is not their model. On the wireless side, they have this bandwidth capped model. They use particular technologies. They have scale. They have their own plans, which they may or may not be willing to share. And on the wireline side, as I said, investment is stopped. That's for the big incumbents. For smaller private entities, we actually had conversations with a couple, like a couple of co-ops and nonprofits that are very active in parts of West Virginia, for example. And they said, yeah, sure, we'd be willing to come to Garrett County, and we own and operate a network if the county paid for it. And that this is the challenge. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is putting their money where the return is going to be greatest. And frequently that's in their local area and where they're at home. And the challenge with this on the county paying for this and then giving access to a private sector company is, number one, these numbers would have to be quite a bit higher because that private sector company would not be happy to just break even. There would have to be some kind of an additional guaranteed rate of return, which, by the way, is the model that the federal government uses in subsidizing rural phone service. There's guaranteed rate of return in many very rural areas for those providers, which is a good deal if you can get it, but not necessarily something that can or should happen here. But the second thing is, when this is done with a private company, how do you pick who the private company is going to be? That's a challenge we ended up with. We definitely started with thinking, is there a private sector partner who would build this in partnership with the county? Maybe some kind of a shared cost or something where part of the burden is borne by the private sector, and we're seeing new private investment in Garrett County and somebody who's committed to operating this network, so it's not just a county or a public sector matter. And the challenge on that was finding anyone who would be willing to make the investment, who didn't require the county to make the full investment, and picking. How are you going to select that company? Is it going to be somebody from out of state that has the operational capabilities, or a small local entrepreneur that may or may not have it? That was the challenge. That's why we ended up with recommending a public investment in a public network, and getting to that governance point that I skipped over before from my recommendations, that we recommend that the county partner with a local nonprofit that does not require a profit to be made, and that would be willing to take on the operational and day-to-day challenge of this, and that is committed to education, economic development, access, and so on. And so we actually had some conversations with Garrett County Community Action, which suggested an interest in having that conversation with the county. And it's a question.
Yeah, you said a huge amount of the investment, the subsidy is going towards jobs. Or labor.
Yeah.
Local labor, because they're having to literally be here to do the work. How many, and is it ongoing? What kind of job?
Forgive me, I'm going to have to look for the numbers because I don't have them on the tip of my my tongue, but let me find you those numbers. And once you, I know the counties are planning to make this available electronically. At the back of the report are all of the financial statements and the assumptions, and that'll be on the summary of expenses as well.
And these are
the income statement.
cabling jobs. These are semi-technical, but not.
They're definitely technical jobs.
But they're not college degree jobs necessarily.
Right. Some are customer service, which would not be a college degree, and some are technician, which might require some specialized coursework or education, but would not require a degree. And the answer is for labor, our assumption was there would be a business manager, a sales and finance manager, an internet technician or engineer. Those would be at 25% of time each, and that could all be one shared job. 1.5 customer service representatives, and a couple of service technicians and installers in the early years to build the network, to actually get the wireless equipment on each home. So 2 in year 1 and 1 in each year thereafter, because the adoption rate would presumably slow down after the first year. So,
and that assumes no growth in the homes in that area. So in other words, you looked at existing homes, presuming additional homes are built. You didn't look at any of those, right?
we didn't. And this was all also based on the assumption that there would be a 30% take rate. If the take rate were 65 or 80%, which would be great, it changes the economics completely. You need a lot more customer service staff, you need more installers. You're buying more customer premises equipment, that's the equipment that goes on the home. Buying more commodity internet bandwidth. It becomes a much more complex network, but it also means quite a bit more in the way of revenues. that's the big picture on that particular recommendation. And this would get you to the 90% goal. The other recommendations are far more incremental. So for example, if Comcast and Chantel were to decide that they like the maps we all put together and they're going to build to all of those locations we identified, they'd reach another 800 homes. It's going to be in handfuls. That said, some of that's going to happen, and all of these different steps taken together could make a difference. Other than on the wireless mobile side, though, we don't see the footprint expanding much absent some county involvement and investment.
Joanne, if we guarantee a 65% take rate, would that be enough of an incentive for one of these private sector partners to build the network?
If you guarantee a 65% take rate, so this network cash flows at 65%, right? So they end up at a net zero, right? There's no profit in that.
So if it were $50 and 65% take rate.
I think if you guarantee a profit, finding a partner wouldn't be too difficult. You'd want to be sure that they're an operationally capable partner. You'd want to be sure that there are a whole bunch of things, because some of the smaller entrepreneurs around the country who've been in this field have been somewhat fly-by-night. But I think finding a partner, if these numbers get high enough, is entirely feasible. We spoke to a couple who I think would be very interested, who we actually did have some confidence in on the operational side. But I can say, just based on my own experience, that I think 65% is a real stretch, even at $40 a month. I'd love to be pleasantly surprised. I was by the market research, so one never knows. But this is just a very, very tough industry, and part of the challenge is that the market, in many cases, doesn't understand the value of the infrastructure yet. So we, as a nation, we have this enormous challenge that we have lots of people who don't understand the value of this, or don't understand why it's worth spending a little bit more to get a better product than they get over dial-up or than they get over DSL. And it's very hard to demonstrate it to them because they're not seeing it. Fiber to the home in particular, we all know intuitively that very big bandwidth could be just extraordinary economically in all our communities. But we don't have a lot of data to point to because we don't have test cases for it. So this is the challenge on broadband. Is why I tend to be very conservative in my projections.
You said at the end of 5 years you're looking at you're sort of back to needing an investment. Is that really the whole amount? Or is that, because some of that is presumably in towers and things that is...
This is all based on existing tower infrastructure, and we try to keep the cost as low as possible by using existing infrastructure wherever possible.
So it's
most of it's equipment. Yeah. One tower can cost this much depending on where it is, so that wasn't something that we wanted to push toward.
What's the lifespan of the equipment that you're proposing to put in? How long does that live? And if it were to, what happens to it when a customer drops off? And what happens to it if that particular customer's equipment is to break? Is this a highly costly point-to-point infrastructure? And when it breaks, the customer's standing there going, well, I don't have $1,200 to spend on a panel to put back up on my house. And secondly, what's the cap on the actual broadband throughput? Saying we're able to force some decent fiber broadband or bandwidth to it, what's their limitation in that last mile? If we can force 25 megs to them, what do they actually end up with at the end? And especially on the upload side.
On this technology, it's probably 3 or 4 megs down one up,
Okay.
even with fiber backhaul, which is also one of the assumptions here, because of the one-year on the fiber.
I'll interject too. That's on a per channel basis of the way space. You could, if you have an area that needs more bandwidth, we could use 5 or 6 channels to do that. So we could, there's a little flexibility. And the technology is so new that again, a year from now, the technology will have changed in maybe 2 or 3 or 5 times that throughput. So.
Thank you for the technical clarification. As you all know, I'm not the engineer. There's quite a bit more detail in the report that was written by my engineers and vetted with Ms. Henning. We're still talking about a product that's superior to DSL in terms of bandwidth and certainly upload speed, both download and upload speed, and that would be pretty solid and very reliable, and that unlike many wireless technologies has the capability to penetrate through stucco, through brick, through broadleaves, and so on. In answer to your question about the life of the technology, wireless technologies of this sort are generally considered to have a 5 to 7 year life. You can certainly stretch them further, but what we frequently find is not only will they deteriorate because a lot of this is outside, but you may not be able to get support any longer from manufacturers for certain technologies. But it's both on the consulting side and just in terms of what the industry does, we usually plan on 5 years, 7 at the most, and we tend to, in a perfect world, you're accumulating over that time period a reserve fund out of your cash flow to fund the refresh or replacement of the technology at the end of the 5 to 7 years. This doesn't do that. There's not sufficient cash flow.
Okay, so this dollar amount, this $1.2 million, does not allot for any equipment failure rates, does it?
No, it does.
It does?
It does. It's
okay.
Built into all of the assumptions, and when you look at the financial model, you'll see it. There are assumptions around churn, so people who buy service for a year and then drop off, and so on, equipment failure and so on, using sort of standard metrics that we see customarily in the industry.
Thank you.
But the big picture bottom line, if you kind of want to summarize a 1.2 up front or 1.2 over 5 years, it's $250,000 a year of public investment to get the broadband availability to just under 3,000 homes that don't currently have a product that's really an economic development or education product.
Any models that are out there similar?
In this technology, no.
Because there are some horror stories out there of public interest in some of these business ventures of this, and certainly there are bigger areas than this and bigger investments, but
in 2005 to about 2007, there was this craze called Muni Wi-Fi. You probably remember, in which many cities and towns and counties really thought that Wi-Fi technology, which does not have the technical capabilities of this technology, in part because of the spectrum it's in, which is not as good, but that Wi-Fi was going to be the free or cheap solution to the broadband problem. And there were a lot of companies that very aggressively proposed to build it. Many of them were not municipal networks, they were private sector. The technology didn't do what they thought it was going to do, and it turned out to be way more expensive than they thought, and then those companies got out of the business, and in some cases left the local governments holding the bag. And there were lots of communities that built themselves using their own money, but the business plans that they looked at, in many cases, didn't look like this. They were told it will pay for itself, it's going to be free. That's a really, really good question. And the best way I can answer it is to say we are an extremely conservative company, and these are conservative estimates. And if I stood up here or anyone else stood up here and told you that there is a way to get broadband to rural parts of Garrett County at no cost and that it'll pay for itself, that would be malpractice. It's really a challenge to make it happen. And I think that's the difference between now and some of the guidance local governments got in 2005, 2006. They were told, it's not going to cost you anything. In fact, you're going to make money on this. We're not going to make money. It's just the reality of it.
Well, we do make money if we bring people to the county, if we keep you here a couple extra days a week because you have that capability now and you work here instead of your office.
They built a house that they wouldn't have built.
Yeah,
Right.
there are there's a bigger picture capability here than just this network.
That's an excellent point. The true benefits are not captured on this chart or on the financial statements that you'll find in your book. The reason you do it is not based on what's going to show up on the income statement or the balance sheet. All those other things are the reasons. It's quantifying all of those that are tough. That's the sort of big picture on my presentation in terms of what we did, what we found, and what we're recommending. Do you have any more questions or any area that you'd like me to go into more detail on?
Any of the commissioners have additional questions before I turn it over to the public and see if the public has any questions for Jane? None? Okay. Members of the public, go ahead.
Is this report, is it something that could be available to the public, or is it proprietary? It's on your website?
It's on the website.
I was wondering if there was a copy that...
If you want Carol to make copies, we'll gladly make it for you. If you just ask Carol, she can buzz a couple copies out. We just don't want to make a bunch that end up sitting around here, but certainly we can make some available.
I just thought put one in the library that way.
I think that would be very worthwhile for us to at least make copies available for the libraries. I think that certainly that is worthy of our
Ask him,
time. Other questions, comments, Dick?
I'm interested in what the Garrett County schools have now, and will it support remote education that's probably coming eventually?
So the Garrett County schools will, most of them will be connected over the One Maryland fiber, which is excellent because that is the state-of-the-art, best possible communications medium. And then my understanding is that they will be provided service over that fiber. They'll be at exponentially higher bandwidth and internal intranet capabilities than they currently are. In terms of the kinds of communications that happen between the school and the home, this would enable that. This is the kind of product that you can download video, you can stream video at this bandwidth, and because there would not be data caps imposed as part of the model, you could do several hours a day. Have interactive video communications with your child's school, with Board of Ed, with schools in other parts of the state, if those are the applications that emerge. And I do believe those applications are coming, there's no question. We're seeing elite university curriculum being put online at this point. So.
But that's proposed, correct? Proposed. What do they have now?
What do the schools have now?
If you know, yes.
I believe they have leased circuits from the phone company.
Yeah, they have leased circuits, and they're also paying Comcast and that type of thing for just regular internet connectivity. The schools will actually say proposed it's going to happen. The state's building the network currently. So they'll actually have a 10 gig backhaul.
That's not part of this.
That is not part of this. That's not part of this project. That is right. That's the state is doing that.
The fiber portion is definite. It was funded by the federal government and the state. So it's the wireless portion that's proposed.
Well, thank you, Joanne. That was excellent summary, and you clearly laid out the amount of work we have to do over the next couple of years to figure out how to implement this plan. And it will be a dynamic document. We hope to continue a relationship with CTC in some way, particularly as we've got some additional work that we proposed to the ARC for the grant funding, and in there is a portion of it related to some continued interaction with consulting firms such as CTC. So we'll see how that goes. So. Hopefully you won't be a stranger to us as we keep going forward. Again, thank you. We appreciate the work that you've done and the cooperation that you've exhibited, the entire team. It's been excellent. And as we said, the entire document will be posted on the website either today or tomorrow, probably today, and also on Facebook. There'll be an ability to ask questions on both of those vehicles as well. But I think it's pretty self-explanatory when you read through. It's a pretty technical document, but it's pretty self-explanatory. So, again, with that, we thank you, commissioners, for the time and for the support you've given us so far.
Thank you for your work. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.